Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works, a podcast for teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and anyone else who supports teachers in the classroom. This show is a proud member of the BE Podcast Network, shows that help you go beyond education. Find all our shows at bepodcastnetwork.com. I am Gene Tavernetti, the host for this podcast, and my goal for this episode, like all episodes, is that you laugh at least once and that you leave with an actionable idea for better teaching. A quick reminder, no cliches, no buzzwords, only stuff that works. My guest today is Dr. Olivia Mullins. I was excited to have Olivia back, especially after seeing her work quoted in an article or referenced in an article by Natalie Wexler recently. And you'll see Olivia frequently on social media talking about the importance of literacy and content knowledge in comprehension, especially as it relates to science, where she is a science teacher in elementary schools. Dr. Olivia Mullins is a founder and executive director of Science Delivered, a science education nonprofit focused on elementary science and educational equity in San Diego. Dr. Mullins also runs a program called Learning Squared, which provides multi-week science and literacy programming for early elementary school classrooms. Dr. Mullins has developed, implemented, and refined numerous elementary science programs and projects and taught over 1,000 science labs. She is the lead developer of Learning Squared Science and Literacy Program. Prior to her work at Science Delivered, Dr. Olivia was a neuroscientist working at the University of California, San Diego. She received her BA from Boston College in 2004 and her PhD in neuroscience from University of Virginia in 2012. She's also the author of the Kids Science Experiment book, Experimenting with Science, published through the Junior for Dummies series. I think you are going to like this one. Olivia, welcome back to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works.
Thank you so much for having me again. I love talking with you.
Oh, and me too. And as I've told several people, you are my hero on the internet for a lot of reasons. And I think those are some things that I want to talk about today. And I want to, I've read your intro, but I just want to reemphasize something. And as I've told you before, you are doing this work in an almost exact out of order type of thing. Most of the folks who I work with who are very interested in the science of learning and everything having to do with literacy, they started out teaching and then moved on to academia. But you got your PhD in neuroscience, and now you're working with little kids.
Yep. Yeah, and not even cognitive neuroscience. So I guess I like to take a leisurely path or crooked path to a goal.
Well, what's interesting to me about that is that when you are working with students and you're teaching them science, you're not encumbered by a lot of preconceptions that many teachers have because they've been through pre-service training and they get all this. So when you started working with the kids and you're working K3, is that your age range?
Now that is, at the beginning I was K5 and now it's shifted to K3, yeah.
Okay, so you're working to K3. And I think we originally kind of ran across each other because you were looking for better ways to provide science instruction.
Yeah.
And what did you find that just wasn't matching your experience? And then how did you go about finding out some better ways to do that?
Yeah, so when I started Science Delivered, which is the organization I work with, NGSS had just come out, the next generation science standards. And NGSS, they say this is ambitious science teaching. And I thought it looked great. I thought it was great timing. They had a lot of things in there that I did and do still agree with, like the scientific practices. I still like the scientific method, but the practices are more all-encompassing, like analyzing data or communicating data. So I thought this is great. And I was trying to do what I thought NGSS wanted. But as I got deeper into it, I started to realize they were asking for some things that didn't make a lot of sense to me. Most specifically, withholding information and allowing students to think something was the right answer or that it might be the right answer when it wasn't. And so that part of it seemed very anti-intuitive, especially I think working with little kids. It's so hard sometimes to get them to understand anything. So the idea of like, trying to get, the idea of having them understand something, and then you're saying, oh no, scientists revise their models. I know you thought this was correct, but actually it's wrong. That to me seemed really out of bounds. But, NGSS, they're the experts. And so I kind of thought I must be wrong. Well, you have those feelings. I must be wrong, but this doesn't make sense, but I must be wrong. But I just really had a hard time finding any information to the contrary for some time. And so at some point I did. And
So where did you look for information about how to teach that? Was it counterintuitive?
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I probably was starting with NGSS and then I was on, itself, like they have a website and I bought, I'm looking at my books, I bought the books they reference, Taking Science to School and the National Research Council, I think, and looked in all those references, but they all read like case studies or theory. There's a lot of them, so it's not like I looked at every paper, but you're reading through the titles looking for something that might give you some better guidance. And then I was on Twitter, and at that time I was really in like NGSS land. So everyone who cares about elementary science education, at least that I have met or met online, was an NGSS person. And so I pushed back a little bit, but it's just no one seemed interested in that pushback. And I think I started to maybe be this person who was saying things that people maybe didn't like in that world. At some point, two things happened. I'm not sure the exact order, but I read Dan Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School? And that was just like, think that it was like information I had been looking for. Yes, novices are not experts. They are not the same. And we can't just treat them like that because a big part of NGSS is that in order to learn science, you must do what scientists do. That's what they say. But of course, a 6-year-old is not the same as a professional scientist. And I think I said on there last time I was on as well, it made me a little cranky too, because I'm like, well, if we're going to have the kids do what scientists do, they should be going to 1-hour lectures because that's what I did as a scientist every week. Or, so it's like NGSS just took the most kind of high level, exciting, top of the pyramid part of science and said that's what kids should be doing all the time, but ignored all this other part. And I'm going to take that back. That part is very exciting, but it is also exciting to honestly repeat people's experiments. How many things do you actually discover as a scientist? It's a very small amount compared to what you know. But it's very interesting to learn what other people have done as well. So that happened, and then I found Zach Rochel's Twitter account. And that was really my entry point into the science and learning community. And at the time, he was tweeting a lot of papers about direct instruction. And that was just so useful. So I would say almost everything I've learned has been downstream of finding that account and Dan Willingham's book.
I know you had been on a journey because at some point, we were having a conversation, and I think you had read Teach Fast,
Yes.
and so you had some clarifying questions,
Mhm.
and I think we had a couple conversations like that, and then I realized, why aren't I talking to Olivia anymore? So she's got it. I mean, because most of the questions that you had were, well, I thought so. That's what I thought you were going to say. That's what I thought you were going to say, and because they are just the things they just do make sense.
Mhm.
So you migrated how you presented to your kids using more explicit instruction,
Mhm.
and was but that wasn't the complete answer. I don't think that you were looking for that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things going on because I have our direct programming through the nonprofit. And that is a little more constrained because we go in for an hour, we do give the teachers lessons, but there is sort of this fixed way that has to happen. And I will say, I actually never fully followed NGSS at all because the way NGSS works would requires you to really teach every day. And in my programming, I wasn't able to do that. And I wasn't able to say, I wasn't, teachers do often use what we give them, but they don't have to. So I always was using direct instruction anyway, or, small direct instruction,
Right.
not, you know,
Yeah.
just, I mean, it didn't make sense to me to do this other way, but I probably would have tried it if I had a different setup. But then I also started to realize, kind of parallel to our direct programming work in San Diego, that hey, no one is in this space of looking at explicit instruction and science education in early elementary. There's almost no, I don't want to say quite no one, but it's close to that. There's people who are looking at explicit instruction at that age. It's mostly reading and math. When you have people looking at science and explicit instruction, it tends to be starting in upper elementary and then secondary school. So the science education people in early elementary are pretty much all student-led NGSS people. So I had no guidance on those specifics. I had a lot of guidance on more general things. And yeah, the question I asked you last time, which now seems, once you know something, it seems obvious. But I was like, everyone's saying you have to use worked examples. And I just couldn't wrap my head around I'm like, how does that work in science? Okay, it doesn't really, it's for procedures or math. It doesn't make sense for content, right? So if you're doing a procedure, you can do it, but for the content piece, no. So, I think that's a great example of cognitive load. There was just so much information, that
Yeah.
I had that I couldn't make heads or tails of some of the advice. And so I started to realize, like, hey, no one is really giving specific advice for teaching content in early elementary. And it's very different because you can't rely on even reading. Like the kids can't read as much as they can listen, but then you don't have a record, right? Like if you're a fifth grader, you can read something, you have it there, you can reference it. If you're a 6-year-old and you're being read to, you can't reference back what was just read to you. So teaching content at this age is different. And then science, you have the additional piece of hands-on activities. And I will say, when I first got to the Twitter space, there was some amount of like saying hands-on activities aren't a good thing. It's kind of being lumped in with inquiry-based and project-based learning. And that's just, you absolutely need hands-on in science. I mean, the information that you're getting, a lot of it is in a 3-dimensional space, right? So you can't just read about it. As much as you can, you need to experience it as well. You want that to be directed, you want it to be careful and intentional. But you can't just read about dissolving and never dissolve something yourself. That's not, or you could, but it's not as effective, right?
Yeah.
So there's all these things that just I felt like there was no guidance for. There is one book, but it's just the one. And so I've started working on, okay, how do we do this and how do we integrate with literacy? And yeah, I've landed on this explicit oral language instruction, especially as the story champs people do it, as like, okay, this is how we have to do it. And so I've started integrating that a little bit into our direct programming, which is slow because we have everything all set up and now I have to go back and tinker with it. But it's been transformative, honestly. So making sure that all kids are saying full sentences, the turn and talks, which are difficult but necessary, the choral responses. I wish I had data, but from my experience, I hear a lot more kids talking like scientists, like, using full sentences, using our vocabulary, whereas maybe before it was the higher kids that were able to do that.
So kind of your next step, as you said, is to include literacy. And
Hmm.
so we're looking for a big thing in science. Like you said, you need to have students who know something.
Hmm.
And that's part of the knowledge building curriculum. It's not only that they have to know something, but they're going to read about it.
Hmm.
And you were going to read about it. And then that became something that you became very interested in, about reading comprehension and how to do reading comprehension. And it was really important to you that the kids
Hmm.
did comprehend because, like you said, you're there once a week or however,
Right,
many
right.
times. So what kind of was your journey in a deeper understanding of how kids comprehend text?
Yes. And well, I have two parts of this. So the first one is getting interested in this because when years ago, say 5 years ago, because I've been doing the combined science and literacy for many years now and, still learning lots, I realized we weren't, if you just talked about science, you weren't getting that far. So I started to think maybe we should talk about science and literacy combined as a way to get people to care about the subject. Now, of course, at the same time, I was also interested in that just for, because it seemed beneficial. And I was starting to see research saying if you combine them, it was more powerful. At that time, I didn't have a strong sense of how you would ever do that. I mean, I was thinking, I guess you have a read aloud. I really knew nothing about teaching literacy. So I started to get interested in that. And then I had that little slightly cynical reason and the real reason. As I learned more about it, I thought, wow, the research on this is so powerful. Clearly, this is the way we should be teaching. We should be clearly integrating science and literacy. And with that, I started seeing the knowledge matters kind of stuff, saying that, okay, you need content knowledge for reading comprehension. And that made a lot of sense to me. So I just started, I was just consuming as much as I could about trying to learn best practices. When we started, I had a literacy co-teacher who taught me a lot, and I've had to integrate these things with the vocabulary and all this. And so I started looking into all that research. From the NGSS too, I had realized you can't always just trust what people say. If it's something, I'm argumentative online, but if you look, I really only argue hard about two things, and that is explicit instruction and, well, I said two controversial things, let's say, and content knowledge and comprehension, because I don't like to argue about things I haven't looked into myself pretty deeply if they're controversial. But I do like to look for myself because I realize everyone is wrong sometimes. And that's was a very good lesson. No matter how respected they are or smart they are, if it's your main thing, you should go to the sources yourself. Like if you're going to be an advocate, if you're going to push this, you should go to the sources yourself. Now, I can't do that for everything, right? I don't look at the math papers myself. I don't teach math. So there I trust the experts. But so yeah, I started looking at the research for comprehension and content knowledge. And I think at this point I've read most of it, that at least for the experimental research.
I think, again, that you are exactly opposite of how folks normally do things. And that makes sense based on your background. Based on your background, pretty much, I think a PhD in any topic is going to be looking for research,
Yeah.
But I think that there were two things that really stood out to me as I was looking at what you were doing online and the types of research you were doing. Is number one, different than somebody who had been through a lot of pre-service programs and a lot of training. You didn't mind challenging some folks who were kind of the gurus, kind of big names. And I think, again, that is part of just having the confidence of being able to look at the research and say, whoa, that's not exactly what this says.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you admire it. Yes, it is difficult for me not to argue if I disagree, to be honest. So, like I said, if I'm not sure, then I don't argue. I will ask and be curious, but I do feel like there's some things that I feel sure about. And if people are saying the wrong things, clearly in my opinion, they're the wrong things. In their opinion, they're not. And I think the more influence someone has, the more concerning it is. If you're someone who's very influential and you're saying things that maybe don't seem right, then I feel like that needs to be challenged because it shouldn't just sit there and influence people. So I get that's just it's a good thing and a bad thing. you know. Sometimes I think maybe you could just let things lie a little bit. But yes, I have also been surprised because there was a series of papers I kind of had read early on before I knew so much about the controversy with comprehension and content. And then people are saying there's not a lot of experimental evidence. So I spent a long time before going back to those because I thought they were all kind of program studies with a lot of things not controlled and confounded. And it seemed like, well, all these people are saying there's no experimental research. So that's kind of my memory of reading these papers too. But, in the last month, I went back and looked at them closely and found actually there are several studies that do control for basically the literacy instruction. So the argument,
just for 1 second
yeah,
to bring our listeners along, what you were looking at is literature regarding best ways to teach comprehension.
yes. Well, yeah,
And there seemed to have been a dichotomy between teaching comprehension strategies and to help comprehension versus content knowledge as a
yeah.
roadway to comprehension.
That's been the debate, although I like to not put those against each other. I think depending how you define strategies, there's a small place or a large place, again, depending on how it's defined, for strategies in teaching comprehension. So yes, thank you for bringing that back. The the literature I'm referring to is specifically looking at, does content instruction increase students' ability to comprehend text? And there's a lot of people saying we don't have good experimental data for that because a lot of the studies that looked at kind of these content pieces had a lot of literacy instruction within them. So it'd be like a program that's 8 weeks or 12 weeks or a year, and they do science instruction and experiments, but they also do a ton of reading, they have this way of looking at text. And so there's just all these changes, a lot of variables changed. And then at the end, they find often, not always, they find that this did improve reading comprehension. So there's two issues that people were saying. A, all those, so many variables were changed, so you cannot attribute those changes to content instruction. B, they said there's no studies that do that and look at standardized reading scores. It's like researcher created or domain specific text. So say the students learned about birds, then the researcher might give them an article about birds, and they can read that better than the group that didn't learn about birds. They said for it to matter, some people say, for it to matter, you need to show that content instruction has significant effects on general reading comprehension tests. And they were saying those studies didn't exist. But in fact, some of those studies do exist. Now, it's not a ton, but there is these authors, Romance and Vitale, I think it's pronounced maybe, and they have a 5-year study with a series of papers where they gave science content instruction for 2 hours a day. And the control groups had an hour and a half of the basal instruction and a half hour of science instruction. And what they tried to do is match the goals for the literacy instruction with, the literacy and science. They tried to match those goals to the basal readers, right? Like, what does the district say we should learn? Okay. So they did this for many years. They expanded their base and they saw significant results in a standardized reading test. They also had a first and second grade program that was more like versus business as usual. But that study is there. I mean, those studies are there and they're pretty strong. And there's another group that has something similar as well.
These are the studies that talked about the importance of content knowledge on comprehension. Okay.
Yes. These are all well-cited studies. They're in all the literature, but somehow they didn't cross that bridge to the online discourse. And I was also saying, oh yeah, the experimental data is not as strong. The correlational data is strong. That content affects reading comprehension. So I don't know. I mean, maybe there are more issues with those studies that I'm not seeing, but I think the data in general is so strong for the fact that content instruction integrated with literacy is really the way to go. And I don't think there's any excuse to wait anymore to just full-heartedly say we need students to be knowledge building for both the content learning and for comprehension.
I think that folks are going to be interested in some of the analysis that you did, and we'll put a link to your paper in the notes. But you seem to have attracted a lot of attention over the last few weeks about a critique you had done about some meta-analysis on this topic.
Yes. And so, yeah, I mean, this is published on Substack, and I want to also give the disclaimer, I am not a statistics person. I don't have training in that. Also, many biologists do, but many don't. So, nothing I did was as complicated statistically as this. So with that disclaimer, the Hansford et al. Meta-analysis came out that looked at many different measures of what affects reading comprehension. So they looked at content, they looked at cognition, cognitive strategies, all sorts of different things. I mean, I'm focused on the content piece. And the paper itself was fair in its conclusions. They basically said, we just see these weak effects, or depending on how you slice it, we don't see any effects of content instruction on comprehension. But, this can't be, they had something very but this does not mean you shouldn't knowledge build. It was very even, right? But of course, right away on social media, people are going, should we rethink content? Should we rethink this? And I'm just, no, we shouldn't, for so many reasons that it's even, I feel like, hard to list them all here. But there's data that wasn't, there's correlational data, first of all, that everyone likes to poo, but it's quite strong and clear, and it's uncontroversial. And then, as I said, there's these studies that were actually not included in the Hansford et al. Paper for reasons I'm not clear about. I have asked. So I'm not sure why they weren't in that meta-analysis. They seem to fit the criteria. And I think there were just papers in there that I would not have picked as well, that were looking more like they were looking at actually teaching strategies versus content instruction itself. So I don't even know if you rearrange things, how the results would turn out. But I would say that the set of papers in there would not be the papers that I would pick to give us an idea of how content instruction affects comprehension.
Again, going back to, I think, your experience, your academic experience, when I read that piece, I mean, a lot of things you like to say, as you just described, you're looking at methods, looking at what should be there and what shouldn't be there. And again, looking at it with a much more critical eye. And I appreciate people like you, then I don't have to do the work. And but okay, so let's get like to a bottom line here, because I'm like you, I'm kind of, I don't want to say I'm upset, but it just seems like we get traction in something, and then now we have to have a controversy. And now we have to stop doing this. And so what have you found? What have you found in your work, not in the research that you've read, but what have you found in your work when you're working with young kids? Which is more important? Or is there one more important, content knowledge or strategies? What's your feeling?
So I am an enrichment teacher. So I don't get to the point where we're testing them. So I would say my knowledge base on there in terms of, what's effective comes from research. I also will point out, well, there's always 10 caveats, right? But the whole system of knowledge building is supposed to be slow, right? Like, it's not necessarily true that if you learn more content in kindergarten, you will necessarily see that content affecting reading comprehension in first grade. Theoretically, it might take 2 or 3 years, because the idea is, if you learn about eels, how often are you going to encounter eels in text? I mean, that's a random one, but you're trying to build up a critical mass of things so that you have more chance of encountering the things you know about in text, right? So from the theory, I actually thought you probably need 3 years, because there's so many things you can know. And that is probably the quote unquote best argument that the critics make is, there's so much knowledge, how can you teach it all? But I always point out, well, actually, there's a lot of knowledge you teach in content instruction as well. So having said that, though, there are some papers that see effects in like 12 weeks on these Guthrie papers. They have a 12-week program. There's even one where they had the exact same instruction, except one group got more hands-on activities. And that group on a standardized test had higher reading comprehension, which I was wondering. But I think what's actually going on is there's two things, right? Like, one, the actual content you learn will help you make inferences but I also think when you are doing a content approach to text, that the students are more engaged and they're more interested in the text and they're able to engage more deeply with it. And that Guthrie paper that looked at hands-on activities, I thought, what? I said, look, I'm a huge hands-on person, but that to me I wouldn't even make those claims. But I read it more and I read their argument, and they said, they did statistics, which I can't comment on. They said all the effect of those hands-on activities were through motivation, were counted for by motivation. And I started thinking, well, that could make some sense, because it's not just the motivation during the test, right? It's not just that you're motivated when you take that final assessment. You're more motivated for the whole 12 weeks. So for instance, they had the kids taking apart owl pellets, and then they would read a text about owls. And so now when the kids are reading the text about owls, I would say the theory is, they're really into that text and they are really getting that practice and engaging with that text. And I mean, honestly, I think it's almost like gaining reading skills. It's gaining skills, but through another mechanism. They're practicing and getting better at reading from that motivation. That would be someone can tell me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of my thought, because to me, you see some results earlier than I would think from just the content knowledge alone. So I think you're getting like a twofold effect when you teach literacy through content. And as an aside, absolutely you should teach high quality fiction and all that too. It shouldn't all just be science and social studies nonfiction, but that's what I know about. So that's what I talk about. But you said, what do I see for myself? So yeah, I think the research is hard to see for yourself because it does tend to be this longer term thing. But what I see is with the content and the explicit language instruction, because I'm with little kids, remember. So reading is a whole different thing there with a 6-year-old or, I do see it. I mean, I really feel like it has elevated our programming so much. Doing the intentional literacy, because there's always some literacy, right? But doing it intentionally, using best practices, I really feel it. And my schools are the highest poverty schools, a lot of challenges, and I really see kids learning and being so excited and doing so well. So, it's interesting too because taking almost like a view that's maybe controversial to me. With the youngest kids, like I said, they can't reference a text. So I'm actually starting to go towards when you're teaching a hard concept that you should teach it with slides, have a ton of interaction, a lot of choral responses, turn and talks, all this. And that the text, the read aloud text, should be something that's a little more conceptually easy. So, for example, if I'm teaching kids what pitch is for sounds, that would be through slides. Because trying to teach them all that information in a read aloud text, it's not quite, in my opinion, the right format. And then maybe afterwards we have a story about how adults can't hear high pitched sounds and kids can. And there's like a little thing, and that is easier to follow. And that can be the read aloud text that they work with. And you have to have it be read out loud because they cannot decode at the level that they can think at that age.
It's interesting you're talking about kind of the order of how you present things, that there's some sort of explanation and then there is some reading to go with
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
when we look at language arts, especially like secondary, and not especially secondary, but in language arts, we do some reading about the background.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's a historical reading, depending on what the setting is. And
Mm-hmm.
so it is just the opposite
Mm-hmm.
order.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, as you described, part of it makes sense based on the skill level of the students.
Yes.
But the content knowledge has to be there before you ask them to do something, to make judgments, to make
Mm-hmm.
predictions, all of
Absolutely.
all of those things. So the other thing that's interesting to me is that I don't know what happened in the other states, but in California, the big move with Common Core language arts standards was to take away part of the literature piece with respect to
Mm-hmm.
reading and
Mm-hmm.
put it into content areas.
Mm-hmm.
So they were reading more informational text,
Yeah.
which again, we're kind of begging the question of, they need to know the content first to be able to understand. So where are you now? Let's just talk about,
Wait,
so,
actually, Jean, can I comment on
oh,
that? 'Cause
sure.
I think that does bring up a really interesting point because I think literature can mean a lot of things. And so I think content instruction will help generally for all reading for reasons enumerated before. But I do think it's also, it might not help you as much to read like Harry Potter, your science class, as it will help you to read science texts. And so I use Harry Potter because I actually flip through it to see if I flip through my kids' books to see if anything I teach is in there. And that, or that you would teach in social studies. And that was one that I didn't see a lot of references to science or social studies versus like some Spy Kids series my kids have had a million references to plants and geography and everything. But, I think it's okay. And I don't like that the narrative was like general reading comprehension has to be better in order for content instruction to be important to comprehension. Because I think, no, if you teach science and you teach social studies, and those kids in third, fourth, fifth grade and middle school can better read their science texts and better read their social studies texts, that is enough. That is a good academic outcome. This demand, which now I think actually there are studies, but this demand that it has to show up on a general reading comprehension test, I always found to be a little sideways. It is enough if it's domain specific because we are in school. School is academic. You actually do want students to be able to read nonfiction text. So That's my caveat. I do think it helps everything, but I think it's going to help the domain specific text probably first. And that's okay because that is part of school, right?
Oh, well, did we solve anything yet, Olivia, here?
Solved, I think everything.
Well, I think one of the big things that we've talked about is that it's not either or.
Hmm.
How you present material, the order in which you present it,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
coherence, so that it's not just these disparate things that you're doing, but you're actually helping the students make the connections. This is why I get upset about these arguments. Like I said, there's the science, but then there's the artistry
Hmm.
of putting these things together, keeping the kids excited,
Hmm.
and in many ways, I could just imagine you in your classroom asking a question, and then let's take a look and see what somebody else says. Now let's see
Hmm.
if we see the same thing, type of thing that you're leading them along. But I just don't think that. I was a philosophy major,
Yep.
and one of the what people always would argue when they were just arguing to argue is like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? That a lot of this stuff it's different, but it's not important.
Right, right. And yes, and that's okay. One thing when I did come into all this late, right? I came into this argument about content knowledge and reading comprehension. And at first, I was totally perplexed because I'll be honest, when I saw the details of what everyone was saying, I thought there's really not much disagreement here. There's a lot of it did feel like a fight that where there was a yeah, if the messaging, I think the fight was in large part over the messaging or in response to the messaging. But when you started asking people what they really thought about how things should be taught, there was some space, but it wasn't nearly as much as you would expect given all the ruckus, right? And that was really confusing to me because I'm learning people who I felt were kind of putting down knowledge building, they weren't wanting a strategy of the week approach either. And if Timothy Shanahan just had a blog where the text is king and you have to really grapple with the text and make meaning of it. I mean, to me, that's adjacent to knowledge building. That's what the text is king if it's even more king or queen if it's not scattered, right? If you have cohesive content, or we can say high quality literature, it's much easier to grapple with that text in a meaningful way. So it doesn't seem like anyone was really promoting a strategy of the week approach. I think also there was confusion about the term strategy, which is why don't. So, you would see people say strategies are really important, and then they'd link to papers about fluency. Well, I don't know anyone who doesn't think fluency is important, right? So I think some people were using strategy to mean this very discrete, like, let's learn how to make an inference and make it, and then spend, you know, every day on that. When I think there's starting to be agreement that kind of instruction is important, but should be limited. And it seems, yeah, I don't think there's as much space as people think. And then maybe this might be speculation, but I think there might be concerns about, if it's implemented a certain way, does that take time away from the content instruction that was already happening, which I think is a valid concern. I think there are very valid concerns about implementation. I mean, I go on teacher groups and I think it's more favorable, but certainly mixed opinions about some of these knowledge building programs. I haven't looked at all of them. I would probably pick CKLA, that would be from what I know. But there's aspects of the science teaching I would like to change, So I think if teachers don't understand what they're doing, why they're doing certain things, and suddenly this is very different curriculum, it can go sideways. So these are all really valid concerns. I just think we should name the actual concern and not use it as kind of a way to put down knowledge building. The same way there's concerns around phonics implementation, but everyone agrees that students need phonics. The dosage, the programs, there's always going to be issues there. So, yeah, I think people agree on more than they think.
Yes, I do too. And it's just, again, the whole phonics thing now, you know, we just moved, we just, this agreement, that we need to do more phonics. And then all of a sudden, but wait a second, you're doing too much phonics.
Right.
Holy,
Right.
come on.
I don't see, Jean,
Uh,
this is a place where I'm silent.
yeah.
See, I don't argue about everything. I don't know about phonics. I mean, I don't know the best way to do anything in phonics, so I just watch the debate and stay
Well,
quiet.
well, again, and that's why I think what you have to say is so important because it represents kind of a clean slate, except for your experiences in the classroom.
Hmm.
So your experiences in the classroom are going to validate, what you find in the research or
Hmm.
not, or
Hmm.
but you're walking in there with an open mind, not
Hmm.
already have been trying to have somebody convince you of this is the way to do it. So
Hmm.
it's again, I just appreciate your thinking, and when I read your stuff, I just put a lot more credence towards it because it is pure looking for knowledge. I mean, and I didn't want to use the word knowledge, just looking for the best way to do things based on the experiences that I'm having with my kids in front of me now.
Well, I mean, those are high compliments. And, I think I've been argumentative my whole life. So I've had to learn, I had to learn to maybe not argue. Now, look, I had lots of friends. I don't want to be sounding like I'm some crazy person, but, I think I really did have to learn how to be wrong and how to be very careful when you argue because that has something I have learned now I'm 43. Only argue about things that you really know about because it's really embarrassing to have to back down after, getting really staking a claim and then you're wrong and you didn't know about things. So I do try to be really careful. And, there's that saying in writing, which is kind of vulgar, but it's kill your babies, right? Like if you're writing something, you can't hold on to things just because they feel precious. You have to look at the whole picture and you have to make sure that's the best. So I really try to go by that. And I try to imagine if I was arguing the other way, what evidence I would pull. And I really like with the explicit teaching, I really try to disprove myself and with content knowledge. If you were on the other side, what would you be pulling? What would you be saying? And try to disprove yourself. And that is an approach I take. And if you can't, then I usually feel pretty confident going and advocating for that approach. But, for inquiry, there are many caveats. There are many kind of mini inquiries or this or that I personally consider part of explicit teaching. But I think it is much better to be open-minded and not just try to stake your whole claim on an argument you've already made in the past. So,
We agree, Olivia. Do you have any questions for me?
yes, Gina, I did. I do. Let me pull it up because I emailed it to myself. Oh, okay. It's specific and only so not totally related to what we're talking about, but I was thinking of something. So, I know you do PD. This might be a challenging question. And I know that you always want to have a relationship with the school. That's how you make the most change, right? But what if you are only given an hour or two for a professional development session? Is there a way that you can make some small change within that 1 or 2 hour session? And what would that be?
Well, I would probably start out saying, no, I couldn't, but now I'm going to explain to you how I could.
Yeah, you got to answer. You got to tell me how
Yeah.
you could.
Well, the first thing is think about, you know, there is so much bad stuff and memes online about bad PD
Hmm.
and that the teachers provide. And if you take a look at the things that they're upset about, for the most part, I absolutely agree.
Hmm.
They're don't apply to us, they're just talking down to us, all of those things, which are absolutely valid, which are absolutely
Hmm.
valid. And so if I only had a couple hours, one of the most important things that I would do first would be
Hmm.
to go into classrooms and see what's happening now
Okay.
and to see who might be doing one of the strategies to techniques, whatever we want to call it, that I might be talking about during a training.
Okay.
Because we can turn to those people and we can say, this is already happening in your site.
All
You
right. So
know,
you would get permission to observe prior to the PD and then
yeah.
build that into your session.
Yeah, and
Okay.
you don't have to do a lot. I mean, you could do, and I know teachers don't like to hear this, but it's absolutely true that if somebody knows what to look for during
Hmm.
walkthroughs,
Hmm.
you can, in 10 minutes,
Hmm.
you can gather a lot of data.
Hmm.
And based on what you walk in on, you could pretty much determine what happened before and what's going to happen when you leave.
Okay.
So there's a lot of data there. And the other thing that, like if I was doing secondary,
Hmm.
I always want to do it by department. And
Okay.
you know what? Okay, we're going to
Yes.
have everybody in here. And the reason
Yes.
is,
Yes.
it's not that it's not generalizable,
Hmm.
but you're making the teacher generalize it instead of having them, present within their content area.
Right.
So they don't have to generalize it. I mean, this is an example of what we're doing.
Hmm.
So those are a couple things. And I would want to be sure that if I was only going to be there a couple hours, I would want to be sure that I could also, while I'm at the school, work with the folks who are going to do the follow-up.
Okay.
If they're not hiring me to do the follow-up
Hmm.
training, coaching, et cetera,
Hmm.
we want to be sure that
Hmm.
we can have a plan to support those teachers in whatever we talked about after I leave. But I think it's funny when you talk to teachers about PD. We're working in one district, and we are starting with the administrators, but the administration very wisely also invited all the union officers,
Oh.
the teachers union.
Oh. Okay.
And
Amazing.
okay, and so we did a couple sessions, and I asked the
Hmm.
president of the union. I said, "What is?" And he was just saying, "This was great.
Hmm.
This was really good." And I said, "What do you think is going to be the pushback from your
Hmm.
folks?" He said, "They're going to say we're already doing it. We're already doing,
Yeah. Yeah.
we're already doing it." So the reason that I give that example is there are things that are predictable, and you face them and you talk about them
Hmm.
instead of trying to
Hmm.
hide and BS your way through it.
Right. Right.
And then the other thing about a 2 hour training, probably want to do an hour.
Hmm.
Because most teachers, even if it's worthwhile, they want to get back to their
Yeah.
classroom. And
Yeah.
again, we need
Right.
to respect them. And part of that respect is being as efficient as
Hmm.
possible
Hmm.
and talking to their needs.
Hmm. I like that with secondary, that makes so much sense because, yeah, a literature teacher and a math teacher, you're gonna, I mean, they're gonna be doing very different things, right?
Yes.
Even if there are a few generalizable things. And then I also the idea of we're already doing this. I know there's been conversation, and I really like the idea of you're doing this, and let's do it more. What are you already doing that you can do more?
And I think okay, I'm going to drop some names here
Okay.
so I can, Laura Stam. You
Oh
know
yeah.
Laura?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So she allowed me to work with her and do a little bit of coaching.
Mm-hmm.
And she uses the CK knowledge building
Mm-hmm.
programs.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were looking at how she was doing it. And she was doing it very systematically, using all the things, all the strategies and stuff. And the one thing that I shared with her is that at the end of the lesson, the kids were going to write a 1 paragraph summary.
Okay.
Okay. And she uses the writing revolution stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the only thing that I suggested to her, and she
Mm-hmm.
started using it. And she said it's been very successful. Is that if you're going to want the students to choose 3 things to write about
Mm-hmm.
in a summary,
Mm-hmm.
they should be some of the most important things in that article.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
before you read it, say, you know what, kids, we're going to read about the Nile River today.
Mm-hmm.
And there are 3 things that I want you looking out for
Mm-hmm.
when we read
Mm-hmm.
this. And then she creates a tree map. And so when
Mm-hmm.
they get to that piece, part of the
Mm-hmm.
discussion is, kids, did they talk about the geography here? Yeah. So what do we want to put in our notes? And so it's very focused on those 3 things that are going to lead to their paragraphs that have 3 things in it. She did it, and she changed the lesson like that. And I asked her, well, how did it go? She goes, well, I changed everything. I just had to change everything. But I told her, you know what? Maybe in your head, you changed everything,
Right.
but somebody watching,
Right.
no.
Right.
And so the point of me telling that story is that what was going on in her head was important, that instead of saying, I do this already, it was a shift, but it didn't look any different.
Right.
So
Right.
somebody coming in and watching a teacher say, oh yeah, they're doing that, but they could be missing the most important element to make it successful.
I think I need to go back, now that I know more than when I first read your book. I need to go back. Once you know more, you can pull out the nuggets.
Right.
Because
Right.
I love that. I have a big problem with most informational text for this age. And anyway, it also reminds me of the story chants I'm using and modifying a little bit their informational text part, where you kind of create something so it's structured like that to start off. But anyway, yeah, I love that for when you have these informational texts that are just like, most of them are unwieldy and have way too much information, and which is why I've cut down on using them. But yeah, that's a great approach. But I think, honestly, I think you could, maybe most teachers might do a little preview. I don't know. So I feel like you could frame it. You're doing this preview. Let's expand that.
When I kind of try to get a metaphor for the teachers is when you think Wikipedia, you look up something in Wikipedia and it gives you this little paragraph introduction. And then what's below? All the details related to everything they brought up in that introduction. So what I share with teachers is, that's the story. Tell them the story of this lesson. Broadly, no details, no details. The details are what you're going to look for when you read. But without understanding the story, then they don't know what to look for.
Right. And she's first grade, right?
She was second grade when I worked with her. I think she's doing third. Okay. She's doing third grade now.
Oh, third. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, third. Okay. Yeah, and third you start to be able to reference the text too, which is different than the little kids where you can't. Right. You don't have the record of it. But yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
All right.
Anything else, Olivia?
I think that's all. Of course, we could talk, I'm sure, for 3 more hours, but
we have already determined, and I'm gonna tell on you here, because people who know me know that I'm going to be the last person to leave the party just because I want to talk.
No longer.
And then Olivia's there too. So Olivia, we're just going to say goodbye.
All right, yeah, because if you give me that opening,
Olivia, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Gene.
We'll talk soon.
All right.
If you're enjoying these podcasts, tell a friend. Also, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can follow me on Blue Sky at G Tavernetti, on Twitter, X, at G Tavernetti, and you can learn more about me and the work I do at my website, tesscg.com. That's TESSCG.com, where you will also find information about ordering my books, Teach Fast, Focused Adaptable Structured Teaching, and maximizing the impact of coaching cycles.